Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jonathan Panikoff, Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Council, and along with my friend and colleague David Schulman, the Senior Director of our Global China Hub, it's an honor to welcome you for this morning's event entitled China's Changing Approach to the Middle East. 11 months after Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on Israel and the ensuing war that has taken thousands of innocent lives, Beijing's intentions and evolving strategy toward the Middle East has come into focus, reflected by its approach to the war. The report being launched today highlights a number of fascinating lines of analysis that are new and novel. The change, as the authors put it, in China's foreign policy strategy as a shift from hedging or maintaining positive relations with regional state actors to wedging, attempting to exploit the space between the US and its allies and partners in the region and become a major regional actor itself. It highlights how the PRC's response to Gaza reflects the rising importance of the region in Beijing's overall foreign policy agenda. The report discusses how China's greater influence in the region could reshape the relationships that Middle East countries have with each other and with the United States. And the report notes how Beijing is attempting to capitalize on the crisis to enhance its own power and influence, not just in the Middle East, but in the broader global South, while it seeks to promote its own vision and own international order. The launch of today's report is the first broad public effort to take a true, in-depth, and rigorous look at the shifts I just described, as well as to provide a series of actionable recommendations for the US and its allies to counter China's ambitions and become more engaged in bringing solutions to the region's most pressing problems. We are honored to have with us today the authors of the report, Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative non-resident senior fellow Jonathan Fulton, and the Global China Hub's non-resident senior fellow Michael Schumann. We're also thrilled to be joined by two other renowned experts on the topic, Dr. Dawn Murphy, Associate Professor of National Security Strategy at the National War College here in Washington, and Mohammed Baharoun, co-founder and the Director General of Booth, the UAE's preeminent think tank based in Dubai. It's now my privilege to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Camille Lons, Deputy Head of the Paris Office and Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where she herself also focuses on geoeconomics and relations between China and Gulf countries. Thank you for joining us today. Camille, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. We have really a stellar lineup of experts based on all the time zones possible. I'm going to start maybe to kick us off in the conversation, turning to the two authors of the report who are going to take us through some of the main findings. So as they've been already introduced, but maybe to add a little bit more, we have with us Michael Schumann, who is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. He's also an author and journalist with more than 25 years of experience in Asia. He's currently based in Beijing, and his most recent book is Superpower Interrupted: The Chinese History of the World. And his co-author is Jonathan Fulton, who is a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. He also serves as an associate professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. He's an expert on China's policy towards the Middle East, and he's written a number of books and papers on the topic. You can look, for example, at the book China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies, or also External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies. So maybe, Jonathan, if you could start and kick us off a little bit with some of the main findings of the paper.
Thanks so much. It's great to see you all here today. I really appreciate it. So Jonathan, in his opening remarks, highlighted China's response to the crisis in Gaza, the Hamas attack and the ensuing war. This is something we've been tracking for quite a while, and you can see a lot of these patterns have been consistent well before this crisis. You've seen China changing its approach to the region. I would put it probably about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. I mean, I remember talking to somebody in 2020 and saying, you know, this strategic hedging is a way that international relations has looked at China's approach, where, you know, a second tier or third tier power comes into a region dominated by a much stronger power, in this case, the US. You don't want to disrupt it. You don't want to antagonize anybody. You want to continue to derive these benefits, whether they're economic or energy or whatever, what have you. And China seemed very content to pursue that kind of policy for quite a while. I place it really around the time of the 2017 U.S. national security strategy, when China was described as a great power competitor for the first time. And you could see China starting to pursue a different policy. You could see that they looked at the region differently. I think the withdrawal from the JCPOA triggered a response from Beijing as well. This idea that its approach to the region would have to be more muscular because it had relied on U.S. stabilization to secure its interests. And I think at Beijing, they no longer felt that was a realistic policy. And you could see much more aggressive, you know, whether it's in their outreach to Iran and operationalizing this strategic partnership with Iran, or rumors of trying to build some kind of facility in the UAE, or just generally how they were using rhetoric to try to put some space between the US and its allies. One thing that comes up in this paper is this actually doesn't necessarily serve China's interests, because still it doesn't have the capacity to secure those interests, and it doesn't really seem to have the interest in doing it. So a lot of this wedging strategy seems to be to promote its initiatives like the Global Security, Global Development, Global Civilization Initiative, in its outreach to try to position itself as a leader in the Global South. And we're seeing that just this week with the Forum on China-Africa cooperation that's happening in Beijing. I think they see the Middle East as a region where they can try to develop some of that normative power, some of that rhetorical devices that will, you know, build a consensus that more aligns with China's preferences. At the same time, the crux of it is that they still need the U.S. security to maintain these interests. So it's a very interesting paradox. We go into quite a lot of detail. Michael and I, it was a lot of fun to co-author this with Michael, because based in Beijing and his long experience looking at China, we both came to it with a lot of different experiences and perspectives. So I think people will find it a pretty useful document.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And Michael, if you could add a few points, especially from the perspective of the Chinese foreign policy, because you have been following China and its foreign policy for quite some time. So how does the Middle East fit into China's broader foreign policy priorities, and how have these priorities evolved over time?
Right. Thanks, Camille. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I think it's become pretty clear that China sees the Middle East as a vital region to expand its influence, not just because it's an important region to China in itself, economically, such as a tremendous source of energy, for instance, but also as part of its greater agenda, which is increasingly becoming to build support in the global South as a way of creating partnerships and coalitions that could act as a counterweight to the U.S. and its alliance system. And you can see how important the Middle East is in that by looking at the BRICS expansion from a year ago, in which 4 of the 6 countries that were invited to be new members were from the Middle East, including very close partners to China like Iran and Egypt. But in pursuing that, I think there's great opportunities, and there's also great risks. You know, when China was hedging, it's easy to kind of be everybody's friend, to focus mainly on economic exchange. When you start to wedge and you start to become more involved in the region, you also become more involved in the region's political divisions and conflicts. And that potentially holds risks for China in its relationships with various countries. It could force them, it is actually forcing them to do something that they at least purport in theory that they don't like to do, which is take sides between different parties. You can see that in their approach to the Gaza crisis, when they've pretty obviously alienated Israel. They may see Israel as a very close U.S. partner, so therefore maybe it's not such a great sacrifice. But these things get more complicated the deeper you go into the divisions in the Middle East. For example, the Chinese have not done very much in regard to trying to deal with the Houthis attacks in the Red Sea, and this is an issue that can potentially put them at odds with countries that are very important to China, like Saudi Arabia. So the deeper they kind of involve themselves in the region, the more potential pitfalls they find to their ability to expand their influence and act as an alternative to the United States. And I think the big question from the United States standpoint is, now that China is gaining influence, what is it going to do with that influence? And I think what you see so far is actually not particularly encouraging. The Chinese seem to be willing to accept a certain amount of instability in the region in order to undermine U.S. policy and standing in the Middle East. You can see that in the way they've, I think, exploited the Gaza crisis to appeal to members of the Global South. And you can see it in how do not seem to be using their partnerships and influence with certain countries, for example, Iran, to play a more constructive role in bringing the crisis there to some kind of more peaceful resolution. So I think the bottom line here is that the more that China involves itself in the Middle East, the more challenges this presents to the United States and U.S. policy in the region.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start bringing the other speakers as well, because we want this really to be an interactive conversation. So I'll briefly introduce them. We have with us Mohamed Baharoun, who is the Director General of the Dubai Public Policy Research Center, Bhuth. He's one of the leading experts on the UAE's foreign policy and on the Gulf region more broadly. So he'll help us also getting a view from the region, which I think is quite useful. And we also have with us Dawn Murphy, Associate Professor of National Security Strategy at the National War College. She specializes in Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics and US-China relations. She actually examines China's relations with the Middle East in one of her latest books, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and so actually, I maybe turn to Dawn first to kind of follow up a little bit on some of the remarks that Michael made. How could you add a bit more on, again, like the bigger picture of how this evolution in China's foreign policy is something that we see also outside of the MENA region, and how that reflects into the Middle East? Because we've seen also in recent years a recalibration, for example, of the Belt and Road Initiative. We see an evolution in China's foreign policy. How does that reflect in the Middle East, and also how this kind of hedge to wedge shift, is it something that we see outside of the Middle East as well? Like, how do we relate what's happening in the Middle East to what's happening outside, and the changing priorities in Beijing? I think you're muted.
Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. I do need to start with a quick disclaimer that the views that I expressed today are my own, and they don't represent the National War College or the US government more broadly. I actually want to start my remarks briefly with some reactions to the report, and then I'll try to frame those in terms of what that tells us kind of more broadly about Chinese foreign policy. So I think one thing that we all need to be careful about in talking about change, first of all, this is a fantastic report. I agree with the vast majority of the findings. It's insightful, it's timely, and I think it's really important to look at this, which is still a very fluid situation, but is incredibly important for understanding Chinese foreign policy as well as US responses to China's broader strategy in the Middle East and globally. That said, with this issue and others throughout the Global South, I do think it's important when you think about change to look at change in a historical perspective, and that the authors bring this in. But when thinking about China and the Palestinians, this is part of a very long lineage of China's stance going back decades, right? And that China's been Palestinian leaning on this. So I think we shouldn't, although there has been a more vocal response, and I think that's highlighted quite clearly in the report, it's China expressing its views that are very similar to what they've had for quite a while. And this is true, in other issues throughout the global South. China's had views. I think the authors did a nice job of making the statement that China has strong positions. It just has chosen to not emphasize those positions on many different issues, both in the Middle East, et cetera, and that you're seeing an increase in that. Another thing that I wanted to react to was there was a comment that China has moved barely beyond rhetoric in the report. And I think that's important in looking at this from the standpoint of China's approach to issues in the Middle East and more broadly is potentially different than other great powers. And they are not wanting to put leverage on particular actors in the region, right? They're choosing to not voice their opinion on many of these issues. So I would say the inching barely beyond rhetoric on the current short-term Israel-Gaza war, their analysis is they're not going to be able to actually affect the outcome of the current crisis. And so their focus is on the longer-term resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that public statements really, I think, are the way in which they're attempting to impact that. There was a comment in the report also about China's lopsided response, disqualifying China as a mediator, especially in the eyes of Israel. And I think this is an important issue that we need to look at closely. But I would also urge caution in emphasizing China's lopsided, although it's Palestinian leaning. Great powers in general, especially regarding this particular crisis, have strong views that could be viewed as lopsided, right? So I think it's all relative. So thinking about China compared to other actors as a mediator, I think we need to be cautious. I think China's not willing to offer its own solutions or apply leverage, and that its approach is different. But I think it's still yet to be seen how its current stance on this issue plays out in its view, how countries in the region view it as a mediator in the longer term. I'm going to skip through some of my more other detailed responses because I know that we are going to be short on time, but a few other high-level things that I would say is I think the centering of the report on 2017, I think, is really important. And I think there's many potential causes for those changes, and I think the report is bringing out many of those. I do think in recent years you are seeing a shift in Chinese broader foreign policy to the Middle East, especially to the Arab Gulf. That globally, as well as in the Middle East, China's wanting to play more of a role as a mediator. But I think it's also important to think about the role of local agency, both in the Middle East and countries throughout the global South, in understanding China's behavior. So I think you see this play out in the report, and I know we're going to have comments coming from the region later in the panel. Finally, on the hedge to wedge, I actually agree with the analysis, but I would caution the fact that I think there's still a lot of hedging occurring. So I think this is the very beginnings of moving towards wedging, but that in many ways, China's still pursuing a hedging approach to the region. So with that, I'm going to end my remarks so that we have plenty of time for other panelists.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to a lot of points. We have a lot of things to unpack, actually. I want to turn to Mohammed to give him a chance also to give his remarks on the paper. And we were talking about local agency. I mean, we'd be very curious also to hear from the Middle Eastern perspective, how Middle Eastern countries have been looking at China's growing role in the region, how they have been adapting also to the growing pressures between US-China rivalry, and more specifically in the context of the current Gaza war, how Middle Eastern countries have been looking at China's responses to that conflict. And just before Mohammed starts his remarks, I just want to remind you or to let you know that you can actually ask questions that I'm going to try to tie into the conversation. So to the audience, audience, I really invite you to already start submitting your questions on the askac.org. But yeah, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Camille, and many thanks also for the Atlantic Council for asking me to join this session. I will follow Dawn's approach and have a few comments on the report, and then talk more about how we see things. And I agree that there is a major shift, at least at the beginning, in China's approach. China used to be seen as a one-dimensional superpower, focusing only on economy, and that's its approach and relationship. It has started to change that by using some sort of a diplomatic power. So there's a diplomatic dimension to China's presence that has been seen in supporting the de-escalation with Iran, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and most recently has been seen in the way it was trying to bring together the Palestinian factions in a bid for a post-war situation in Gaza. So there is that shift. I might not look at wedging as something that is extremely obvious as a strategy. I think there is a bit of wedging from both sides, from the US and also from China. But I don't think that is its focus. I think the report, for instance, puts a lot of weight on China's approach to Gaza as a way of seeing this. And honestly, at least from here, I don't see that when it comes to Gaza, China is trying to wedge the region away from the US. It is definitely making or scoring some points, but those points are being scored like in tennis by the mistakes of the US rather than the prudence of China. There is a lot of emphasis on, for instance, it's not partaken in a campaign against the Houthis, but that is true of many other countries, including countries in the GCC, Saudi Arabia and the US, and the UAE did not participate in a mission. Europe decided to have its own mission that is different in approach to the American mission. So there is not that much of it. And actually, I see very much China and the US today, when it comes to Gaza, calling for the same thing. They're both calling for a ceasefire, even though at the beginning, the US did not want to talk about ceasefire at all. But it is trying very hard right now to achieve a ceasefire. And that's what China is trying to do. They're both talking about a two-state solution, which is in the report's particular wording. It's support for Palestinians' national rights. So, which is a state. So there is a lot of similarity, but no much cooperation. And at least discussion with the Chinese, they think that doing more on Gaza, on Palestine, would possibly be seen as trying to, interfere with what the US is doing, and they're better off keeping away. Now, on the region's approach, of at least perspective on China's role, I think there's more seen as a partnership. And that partnership is in lieu with what we're trying to create, which is, again, a global hub in this region. And that global hub, as difficult as it may seem, does not operate on a zero-sum equation, which means we will need to be close to the US, we will need to be close to China, we will need to be close to Latin America, we need to be close to India and Iran and Israel at the same time. Very difficult, but that is the working equation. It is not a zero-sum equation. And there are references, for instance, to the decision of G42 on Chinese companies. But that is, end of the day, is an investment type of decision. It is not, a political decision on leaving China and being a business decision. That means whenever there is a good deal from the US, bet that people in the UAE or Saudi or on the rest of the GCC will possibly give it a precedence or priority. When there is not a good deal from the US, and they need something very bad, I think they would go for other countries, including China or India and the rest. And I will stop there for the sake of time.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I'd like to turn back to Jonathan to continue a little bit that conversation on perspectives from the region, because you've been based in the UAE for quite some time, so you have seen from the inside a little bit the evolution on how the region was looking at China and the Chinese presence. And there was an interesting survey by the Arab Barometer a few months ago that was showing how positive views towards the US versus China in the region had been evolving, especially after the current, in the context of the current crisis. And you see an erosion definitely of the positive views towards the US and on the contrary, an increase of positive views towards China, but maybe there is more to say about that and more nuances to bring to that view. Like, how do you think we should interpret this kind of opinion polls and views? And should we see that as a real positive view of China in the region as a kind of global responsible actor, especially in the context of the current crisis? Or is this more an expression of frustration towards the US and has less to do with China itself? Like, how do you read this kind of polls?
Yeah, that's a tall order, Camille, and it's tough to follow Mohammed on this because he's, I think, better positioned. But like I say, I guess I've been here since 2006 watching it, and from being kind of a dispassionate or disinterested observer, it's just kind of an interesting puzzle for me. I've actually had this conversation with Mohammed at his shop a couple of years ago. We talked about how people were thinking about China here, and it's pretty interesting because you'll see, all of this stuff happens at so many different levels. You mentioned the Arab Barometer survey data, and this most recent tranche tells us one thing, but it's consistent with the longer arc of their survey, that as folks in the region, and I don't think there are any Gulf countries surveyed in it. I think they're looking at 6 individual countries, none in this part of the Middle East. But there are more positive views being expressed of China. There are more negative views of the US, and I think these two things correlate. I mean, the US foreign policy in the region is seen quite negatively by a lot of people on the street, the so-called Arab street. I think if you're talking to folks in the policy community, they have a more, sophisticated view of what is happening with the US. There's a very incomplete narrative of China provides the economy and the US provides the security. And that just isn't necessarily true. There's a lot more happening. The US does a lot more in terms of aid and in terms of developmental support and investment and trade and services, which is very important for countries that, like Mohammed said, are trying to thread this development needle and create sustainable post-hydrocarbon economies. You need more than just selling oil. You need to be doing other stuff. So it is a very complex thing. What I'm seeing, I teach political science at a local university. My students have very strong views about these issues. They tend to not understand China very well because you don't see a lot of people that are formally studying it. You don't see, China or area studies in general happening at a lot of regional universities. You don't see a lot of students going to China, learning the language, taking a summer break there to go to China. At the same time, I mean, I should do a shameless plug here. I have a newsletter on Substack where I'm constantly posting developments in China's position in the region. And you constantly see this trickle of news that doesn't really shape events in a major way, but just taken together, you see a fundamental shift happening where, whether it's think tanks having meetings in Beijing or whether it's Chinese teachers doing language teaching in Saudi K-12 programs, or whether it's, any number of these small scale things that are happening. And this is the hard thing for this report Michael and I did, because on the one hand, you look at it, as I do as an IR guy, in international relations, we tend to look at structural shifts, and you can see this broader Chinese foreign policy happening. And you can attribute that to a change in leadership. Whether it's in the US or in China, you see these big shifts in both countries, and then you see resulting foreign policy changes. But I talk to Chinese teachers and Chinese business people and traders or whatever. They're not thinking about this region geostrategically. They're thinking like, I'm trying to get a contract, and it's hard because people don't really know much about my country yet. They don't speak my language, and I'm just trying to make inroads. So it's really a weird time to be watching it, because on the one hand, you can see things are changing dramatically. Over the time I've been here, it's a massive transformation, because China went from being a very inconsequential regional actor to an important one. And I don't think we're anywhere near the end of that story yet. You know, this is still early chapters in the book, whether it's in AI, whether it's in security and strategy, whether it's in military cooperation. You know, there's a lot of room for things to move. I think that's why folks in Washington are taking it seriously, because you can see that this does represent something new. At the same time, I think folks in the region looking at these developments maybe overestimated what China was willing or able to do. That's why, you know, when Michael mentioned the Red Sea shipping crisis, I think people did expect China to have a more muscular response. I felt that was misguided, because China's told us all, we have no interest in playing that kind of role. And I think after, you know, Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh in December 22, I think there was an expectation, hey, we rolled out the purple carpet, you got billions of dollars in deals, now we need you to show us that you're willing to do more. And I don't think China's there yet. So there's a lot of moving parts. It's really interesting. It's really exciting. If you're somebody like me, you're not American, you're not Arab, you're not Chinese, you know, you can look at it and think, ooh, this is a cool intellectual puzzle. For everybody else who is Arab, Chinese, or American, I think it's much more jarring and consequential. And I think we're right to look at it very seriously.
Michael, actually, to follow up a little bit on this last point that that Jonathan was making on the limits as well of China's influence, understanding of the region. Like, could you expand a little bit on that? Because I mean, last week I was in Shanghai, and I did a few interviews with Chinese scholars who work on the Middle East, and the answer I got to most of my questions regarding the current crisis is that, you know, at the end of the day, China doesn't really have that much leverage and power, that much leverage over Iran as well when it comes to the Red Sea crisis. It's still at the very, and also the Middle East is not that much of a top priority for China's foreign policy. But at the same time, I also get the impression that this is an easy answer to have, and that, you know, it's also a way for the Chinese leadership not to recognize the potential role that they could play in the region. So what's your reading on this, and of like how really influential, sophisticated China's foreign policy towards the region is?
I think that's going to be a huge issue going forward. The more influence the Chinese want to have in the region, as Jonathan said, I think more there's going to be an expectation in the region that the Chinese are going to play a more involved, more constructive role in dealing with problems and issues in the region. And I think the question really comes down to will, and what really is their what is the basic purpose and nature of their foreign policy. You know, this is a government that doesn't like firm alliances, that doesn't, like, at least states and claims that it believes in non-interference, that it wants to get along with all parties and all sides, and that that's a big goal of its bilateral relations. So in light of that, it becomes, well, what kind of will do they have to really roll up their sleeves and dig into a problem like the Palestinian question, and kind of really get their hands dirty and deal with the local players and come up with new ideas and new frameworks and build relationships and do concerted diplomacy to actually kind of achieve a positive outcome in some way. There's a capacity issue on that end, where I think it's very clear right now that their rhetoric on their interest in bringing about a peace in the Middle East is far kind of outweighs their ability to bring the different actors together to negotiate to do anything. But I think it also gets to it's just really what they want to do. And I think that gets to a bigger issue in China's overall foreign policy and overall approach to the global South, which is there's a tension between these kind of big picture ideas that they have about reshaping the global order, about bringing about economic justice, about changing the way diplomacy is done and the way we think about security. And that comes into conflict with their more narrow interests. And you can see that, for example, in how they handle debt restructurings of poor countries. You can see it actually with things like the donkey skin trade in Africa, which is an issue that China is very much complicit in and doesn't seem to have a whole lot of interest in resolving. So you have all of these issues where their narrow economic and political interests come into conflict with these loftier geopolitical goals. And very often these narrow interests will tend to win. So if that's going to be the case going forward, what kind of great power is China going to be in the Middle East? What role are they going to play? And then ultimately, how does that affect their relationships with the individual countries?
Yes, actually following up on that one, I'm going to turn to Down now, but on this question of what kind of player China is going to be, and Michael made a point earlier in his remarks, and it's also a point that you see in the paper about whether China is a stability or instability actor. There's been for quite some time in the literature this idea that China was rather searching for stability in international relations because it's something that, and that includes the Middle East, and that's something that allows it to continue doing business and developing, it's making inroads on economic ties with different countries in different parts of the world. And we hear a growing debate among scholars and China watchers that believe that actually China can be looking for instability in certain cases, or at least it can accommodate a certain level of instability and accept a certain level of cost induced by this instability when the cost are much higher for the US and for its geopolitical rivals, as this is the case in the Middle East. So do you agree with this assessment? And because this is also an important question that we have us as Europeans, for example, because I speak here as my ECFR hat on whether we should in certain fields try to cooperate with China when it comes to trying to promote stability in the region. So do you think that that China in this case has an interest in trying to promote stability in the Middle East the way it says it wants?
So my assessment would be that overall, China absolutely wants stability in the Middle East, and that actually explains a lot of its behavior. Its approach and its interpretation of what will result in stability is quite different, right? So I think it sees the not picking sides in the current crisis broadly, obviously Palestinian-leaning behavior, but not wanting to put pressure on Iran, right? I think it sees that as stabilizing. I think it sees taking a Palestinian-leaning position that in the long term, they see as constructive in resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that they see the current post-October 7th events as a flare-up in that crisis. I think they see that as stability-inducing. The example of the Red Sea, though, I think is an example where they are willing to put their political interests in remaining consistent and not picking sides, especially in relation to Iran, above some of their economic interests. But I think ultimately they're still quite concerned regarding the threats that behavior poses. So I think overall the interest is still in stability. I would also emphasize that Mohammed talked earlier about some of the thinking through what US-China relations look like in this region. And I would emphasize that although the report really stresses that China's capitalizing on current events or exploiting, I really see more that China is keeping its stance consistent with the past. And the US looking bad is a side benefit that they're willing to have some benefits from, but I don't think that's the main narrative or the main driver in their behavior. And I just would point to the fact that if you look at Chinese government statements, the special envoys to the UN, the special envoy for the Middle East, they could be much more critical of the US explicitly. They could make this about great power competition. And I think they're choosing not to because they don't want that to be the overarching dynamic. And I think also in an ideal world, after the current hostilities, in a perfect world, they'd like relations with Israel to go back to the way they were before October 7th. So I think ultimately they want stability. They're willing to play more of a mediator role, but I think their biggest fear is that this is going to turn into a large regional war that really does threaten their interests.
Can you, on the Israel point, can you help us understand a little bit better, like China's position? Because it has been a bit surprising to me, at least, the way, China was so easily throwing by the window the relationship with Israel. How should we understand that the positioning on the crisis and the fact that they have been very unsupportive of Israel during the conflict?
So I don't, as an analyst, I don't look at it in that way. I look at it in seeing their behavior since October 7th. For example, on Hamas, they have never referred to Hamas as a terrorist organization. They view Hamas as a national liberation movement. They've become much more, I think, vocal and clearly articulating in Western forums their views on this. But they've had longstanding views. I think their calculus at the beginning was they should remain consistent with what their stance had been previously. And that obviously right now has a lot more international attention to those positions, but there hasn't really been a fundamental shift. I think what has shifted is Israeli perceptions regarding what's happening on the ground and disappointment, not among all, but among many, scholars, policymakers, et cetera, disappointment that China did not change its position in light of recent events. So again, China looks at the current conflict as a flare-up in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and has a longstanding opinion regarding international law and critique of Israel's behavior in relation to that. So I think that the calculus right now is if ultimately that does irreparable damage to the relationship with Israel, that is unfortunate, but I don't think that's their intent. I think they're trying to continue to stay consistent and to maintain their relations with the Arab world, Muslim majority countries, much of the global South. Their actions resonate and they're getting a lot of kind of positive PR points for that. But I don't think that's the point. I don't think they're taking the stance in order to have that effect, primarily.
Thank you. Mohammed, following up a bit on that from the perspective of the Arab states. So if I can push you a bit more on like how they've really looked at China's response to the current crisis, because there's a bit of a discussion, a debate on whether this has, helped China gain points on the PR side towards the population, the support for the Palestinian cause, or whether, on the other hand, it also you could say that on the hard security issues, the big actor that is still able to shape developments in the region remains the US, and this crisis is also showing that, and it's also showing how when we've seen an exchange of attacks between Israel and Iran, the big actor that has the ability to protect Israel, whether we agree or not, if it's a good thing or not, but the actor that has the ability to do that is the US. And so I'm wondering how this is perceived, especially from the Gulf states, which are like at the moment also negotiating their security relationship with the US, and thinking in terms of like how to adapt to these evolving trends. What do they expect from China? How do they look at China? Does the Chinese behavior in this crisis makes it more credible or less credible as an important partner to these players?
As I mentioned before, I don't think they're doing a lot, but intentionally, because the leading actor at this point on the hostage deal, on the ceasefire, is the US. And I think they don't want to meddle with that. But I really want to talk about this issue of China being a destabilizing force, because a lot of argument is that China did not involve in something like the war in Iraq, for instance, or the war in Afghanistan, that have created ramification that create a lot of instability in the region. They haven't been, they didn't support, for instance, Hezbollah. Even with the Houthis, they did not support Houthis. Yes, they did not attack them, but a lot of other countries in the region didn't. So to say that China has got a destabilizing, either intent or action doesn't really resonate here at all. I don't think they're doing more on Gaza. I mean, they've offered to host a conference, but that was it. They didn't do so. They're not doing much. But and I also don't think they're anti-Israel in the sense. I mean, the U.S., for instance, have sanctioned settlers. China did not sanction anyone from Israel. The U.S. has prevented certain members of the cabinet at the beginning from visiting Washington. They didn't do that. EU, for instance, is preventing certain goods coming from the settlements from entering the market or have to label them as such. That's not what China is doing. And in the view of some Chinese experts that I've met last week, the type of cooperation, scientific research between China and Israel is far more than all of the Arab countries together. So those ties are there. I mean, China did not, for instance, take a position similar to Russia in trying to support Iran against a possible attack from Israel. They did not deploy, electronic warfare systems. They did not provide them with missiles. So I don't think that China is actually anti-US, not even pro-Hamas. I mean, I agree with Don. Their position on Hamas as a resistance movement is connected to this UN resolution on occupation. And as long as there is occupation, there will be. But they did, and again, UAE, for instance, describes or lists Hamas as a terrorist organization. But the October 7th was not described as a terrorist attack. It was described as a heinous attack, but it was not a terrorist attack. And I think a lot of countries in the region have followed the same suit. It's very difficult to, especially in the light of the reaction from Israel. So I think we would possibly need a more balanced approach to China. And I appreciate that the report is coming from the point of U.S. interest and how it sees them. But it's difficult for me to see that China is playing a destabilizing role in the region.
But it's like I'm not meaning that China is playing a destabilizing role in the region, and I quite align actually with the kind of ironic view here, where for many Middle Eastern countries, if there is one actor that is destabilizing, it's more the US than China here. But without being necessarily destabilizing, I'm wondering whether Middle Eastern countries see China as really a player that is a potential stabilizer, or that is really interested in trying to bring stability to the region, or a more opportunistic player that is not really interested in meddling into the politics, and so that is likely to remain in the long term hands off when it comes to security and stability issues.
I think if we look at the role they're playing with issue, if we look at the economic integration role, that's a stabilizing issue. And I think even a lot of the criticism to China in Africa is based on debt traps, which is people who do not pay their debts, which is something that any bank would do, including here in the UAE to me if I didn't pay my mortgage. So they did not play a destabilizing security role. They did not aid, for instance, a coup. So it's again, I think they're playing a more stabilizing role because of the economic aspect, rather than a destabilizing role because of a political or security aspect.
Thank you. Jonathan, you want to come in on this? Yeah, please.
Just very briefly, just to point out that nowhere in the report is China described as destabilizing or trying to destabilize the region. I think we make it pretty clear that China's preference is for stability because its interests are primarily economic. The focus on wedging is in trying to create more space between U.S. and its allies and partners and create this narrative affinity between China's preferences and regional actors. So the idea isn't to try to upend the regional order, but just try to insert itself as being seen as more affiliated with an actor that supports that order, while making the U.S. look less reliable, I think is the point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to intervene?
Yeah,
here?
I'd like to follow up on what Jonathan said. Yeah, I mean, I think if my memory is right, the language we use in the report is that China seems to be willing to tolerate a certain degree of instability in order to achieve other foreign policy goals. And I base that idea on the idea that China could be doing more if it wanted to. I understand the limitations of its capacity in the region. I understand it can't automatically get players to do what China may want them to do. But they do have, Jonathan pointed out earlier, they have a tremendous amount more influence in the region now than they did a decade ago. So the question is, well, what are they going to do with that influence? If they have such close relations with players like Iran, with Egypt, how are they going to use those relationships? And the reality is, what we've seen is that they don't seem to have very much intention of using them to try to play a bigger role in bringing about some kind of a resolution to either the Gaza crisis or the Red Sea crisis. And from my point of view, if you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. They could be doing more if they wanted to, but they're not. And we can say this is kind of their historical foreign policy preferences. We could say that, well, maybe they don't feel they have the capacity to do it. But whatever the motivation of it is, they're not. When I would argue that they could be. And that's a signal to me that they're fine with, on a certain level, with like the turmoil in the Red Sea, even though it's not necessarily positive to them from an economic standpoint. But they're willing to tolerate it because it helps them undermine U.S. policy, build other relationships in the region. It's that bringing stability and trying to step in to resolve these things is not the priority for them.
Thank you very much, Michael. Maybe moving on a little bit from the security and stability question, I'd like to touch a bit on the economic question, because we haven't talked a lot about it during the conversation. It was a lot around, of course, the current crisis. And I think that given that China is a big economic player, it's kind of interesting to bring this point. Maybe if I can go to either Dan or Jonathan on this, but there is one question in the audience on where we are now in terms of like Chinese investments to the region, the BRI, etc. Because the person in the audience points also the gap between what is being announced, all the expectations that they were in terms of like what the Chinese investments in the region would look like, and what has really resulted out of this. And I think it's especially in certain countries, some of the results of the BRI have been a bit disappointing. To some others, it's the contrary. So should I go to Dan? Do you want to go on this first? Like, where are we now on this kind of economic footprint of China? Yeah.
Actually, I would defer to Jonathan because that's a heavy emphasis of the report. So yeah, Jonathan. I mean, I'm happy to comment. Sorry, it is your report.
I thought you were going to give me a breather here, Don. It is uneven. I mean, it's what you see often, and I don't think this is unique to China. I think there's a little too much on the fork. You'll see these announcements like Duqm in Oman, for example, in 2017. There's a lot of talk. China's going to put $10.5 billion into this. You heard stories about, China and Iran were going to do tens of billions of dollars worth of investment. In a lot of cases, I mean, it's not just about China's willingness to or changes within China. Sometimes it's, you know, does a country like Iran have the capacity to absorb that much investment? You know, they don't have necessarily, it's just not going to make sense. So in terms of BRI in the Middle East, what you've seen is a few of the usual suspects getting a lot of investment. Mohammed and I are in one of them now. You've seen a lot of Chinese FDI come into the UAE. You've seen a lot in Saudi, and you've seen it a lot in Iraq. Those are three countries that, through their pretty relatively strong economies are able to accommodate China's ambitions. You're seeing a lot in Egypt, which I think is very interesting. Egypt is becoming a very significant partner for China in the region. And unlike the other countries, it's not necessarily because of the economy. I think in this case, it's because of the geography. I think, Suez and access to the Mediterranean makes Egypt very important to China. And you see a lot of stuff happening, whether it's in the tech space, whether it's in these port projects in Suez, whether it's helping build the new capital city district. You're seeing a lot of stuff happening there. In other countries, frankly, it has been disappointing. There's been this idea of reconstruction that China is going to put a lot of money into Syria, into Yemen, into Lebanon. And frankly, you don't. Chinese companies have become quite risk averse in this. They don't want to operate in a very risky environment. And so you don't see maybe the same stuff that the headlines project. And I would just say, to add to this, a lot of the times the headlines are just chasing a story without doing a lot of digging. So you see a lot of really outlandish reporting about what China's doing here. And, the minimum amount of scrutiny would indicate that often this stuff is really hogwash. So, there is a lot of stuff happening in certain countries across the region. It's not, a lot of less well-endowed countries don't see a lot of Chinese investment, a lot of Chinese purchasing. So it's really nuanced. And I think that's one thing we try to get across in the paper is you see these indicators of certain countries, certain regions are doing a lot more than others. And that also typically aligns with things like which countries have the most advanced partnership agreements with China? Where do you see Chinese companies the most active? It's not rocket science,
Yeah. And as you say, I think what we see, that it's kind of interesting the way a lot of these investments have been focusing on key countries, especially some of the key Gulf states, and moving away actually from the kind of traditional BRI, hard infrastructures projects towards more strategic sectors in the tech sector, especially, and the economy is actually very political. And so even those economic links are becoming actually increasingly securitized or subject to kind of political tensions. This is something that we see quite a lot in the Gulf around AI and emerging tech at the moment. Hamed is nodding because he comes from the UAE. The news a few months ago about this leading AI UAE company, G42, deciding to cut its relations with its Chinese partners to really focus on a big deal with Microsoft is quite a symbol of that. Hamed, I'd like to come to you a bit on that. How can you expand a little bit on how on this kind of strategic economic sectors the Gulf states are trying to maneuver this complicated space? Do they see that as really a vulnerability for their own kind of economic development agendas, or do they see that as a potential also opportunity to position themselves as kind of interconnectors between the different big powers? So how do you see that?
Well, I think this is part of the diversification. And I think, for instance, we're talking about AI. AI is obviously the oil, if you want, for the next century. In the past, you could not turn a light on without electricity, which needed oil. You cannot operate a car without oil. You could not operate a factory. Today, you cannot open a light without AI, and the same thing with cars and factories. So AI is going to be a major part, and I think this is part of the thinking of the region. I mean, in my view, and I don't know much about the decision of G42, but my assessment is that this is a business decision based on a better deal that they have found, and I think that is eventually what would be. And if there are, other decisions that were the, either American or Western companies would provide a better deal, a more, sustainable deal. And I think that's what the UAE would do. If Chinese are offering something else, and we've seen that in mega structures like, metro stations and others, we've seen that they take the best deal available. But again, I think when it comes to the size of investment of China, and that I agree with Jonathan, and I think that there is a lot of hype on how much China can bring in. But in comparison, China is the second largest economy after the US. But you don't see as much of an investment from the US, particularly infrastructure. And you remember I2U2, it was supposed to be a way of providing something similar in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative when it comes to infrastructure across the region that connects it. And that didn't go anywhere. We had to change it into EMIC, which excludes the US, because the US did not have that type of appetite to go in, or I don't know, capacity, political will, you name it. But that is the reality. When right now you see that China is going back to try and figure out how could they revive the Lulu project in Kuwait, for instance. So I think we need to compare apples to apples.
Thank you, Mohammed, for this. I'm going to have one last question, and then we'll unfortunately have to wrap up that session. I'm going to turn to Michael for the last question, maybe to just finish on also the Chinese perspective, still on these economic ties, how important the region is for China economically. I'm wondering, I mean, you're not an energy expert, but just this is a kind of open question, because energy has been obviously quite a central pillar in China's interest in that part of the world, but also in recent years, the evolutions in energy markets and the kind of long-term perspective that energy prices and energy demand globally is going to start declining. I'm wondering maybe whether this is going to change China's perspective on that region. Is it going to kind of make this relationship of interdependence that China has with some Gulf countries maybe more asymmetrical in favor of China, or maybe just China's kind of economic interests in the region are going to shift to other kind of sectors? But yeah, I'd be curious of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic, because there's tremendous codependence here in energy. China gets more than half of its oil from the Middle East, imported oil from the Middle East, and the 90% of Middle East exports to China are energy related or chemicals, including petrochemicals. So this is an immensely important part of the economic relationship. But it's also, I think it's aware. I think there's an awareness on both sides that dependence also creates vulnerabilities, and you see China trying to diversify its sources of energy, and I think that's a major factor behind its closer relationships with Russia. Russia last year actually became China's largest foreign source of crude oil, and I think you also see it on the side of energy exporters in the Middle East, who are trying to diversify. And actually, I think the interesting dynamic here, I think they're seeing China as a potential partner in that diversification. When you see, for example, Saudi Arabia looking to China in electric vehicles, things like that. So I think this is energy. Obviously, is going to continue to be a huge part of the economic relationship. But I think at the same time, I think you're seeing both sides trying to figure out what to do about it and what the next steps would be, and that could change the dynamic in this relationship actually going forward.
Thank you so much for this. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up this session. We've been a little bit over time. This was really fascinating, and obviously we'll continue having this kind of exchanges and conversations on that topic for quite some time, I believe. So don't hesitate to share this around and read the report. It's now live on the Atlantic Council's website. The title of the report is China's Middle East Policy Shift from Hedging to Wedging. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.